So the takeaway is the Israelis will continue to escalate. The Israelis will never let this go. And the Israelis will continue to push for, if not military wars, civil wars inside Lebanon, as they will in Syria, as they will across the region.
Hey everyone, welcome back to MEE Live. My name is Mohamed Hashem. The death toll in Lebanon is rising. Over 300 people have been killed and over 1,100 injured after Israel carried out a massive wave of attacks across the country, striking Lebanon 100 times in just 10 minutes. Israel launched these attacks shortly after a US-Iran ceasefire was announced. Netanyahu has said that there is no ceasefire in Lebanon, as the Israelis claim their goal is to weaken Hezbollah. So what does this mean for Lebanon, for the region, and for a ceasefire that already looks fragile? To unpack this, we're now joined by Karim Makdisi, Associate Professor of International Politics at the American University of Beirut and co-host of the Makdisi Street podcast. Professor Karim, thank you so much for joining us today.
Ahlan, Mohamed. Thank you very much for having me.
No, absolutely. And thank you for joining us during this difficult time. Professor Karim, you're joining us from on the ground in Beirut. Can I just ask you to describe what you have gone through the past couple of days?
It's been a very, as I'm sure I think most viewers probably saw a couple of days ago, this incredible, really unprecedented, even by our standards here. It's a pretty incredible attack across all of Beirut, across all the country, really. But being in Beirut, it was extremely loud. In fact, right next to us, there was a couple of missiles that landed not far from where we are. Very, very residential neighborhoods across the city. These were unlike a lot of the other attacks and missile and Navy attacks. This was unannounced, so it was completely out of the blue. It was during the day. It was a nice day. It was in the middle of the day. People, milling about. People going to get their, doing their everyday things. So it was something really quite devastating. It was quite shocking, and it was done in a very pure sense to terrorize. So it was clear. They didn't even announce that there were particular people that were killed at the end of it. It was a pure terror attack across the city, simply as a way for them to signal that they were not happy with the ceasefire deal that was supposed to have included Lebanon. So this was the usual Israeli and Netanyahu way to say, no, we don't want this. We're going to continue to kill as many people as we want. We're going to continue to terrorize as many people as you want. So it was quite a shocking day. A lot of people were left quite scared, quite frightened. And of course, there were, I think the last death toll I saw officially was over 200 people. And several hundred wounded. So it was quite a devastating strike and quite scary. And the city has been, since then, it's pretty eerie outside. I mean, it is holiday, it's Easter holidays, and today even it's Orthodox Good Friday. So there are holidays, but yesterday was declared as a national day of mourning for all the people that were killed, all the civilians that were killed. There's still people being, some hope of people being rescued in the rubble. But as I said, quite devastating.
Yeah, quite devastating. I wanted to bring up a quote that I heard one of the survivors talk about it the other day on TV, where he was saying that he was an older gentleman, and he was saying that he survived the 75 Civil War, the 1982 invasion by Israel, the 2006 war, the 2020 Beirut bombing, and he's never seen as much destruction in Beirut as he's seen just this past couple days.
Yeah, I think as a single event, because this came all, there's just the multiple attacks all across the city, basically within a few seconds or a couple of minutes of each other. So it was designed precisely, as I said. I think the word is to terrorize. So it was, as a single event in that sense, it was. Yeah, as I said, I think it might be unprecedented, just in the shock value and the ability to terrify people across the city, and as a way, as I said, for them to signal in a battle that they were losing strategically. It was clear that they were losing strategically, both in the regional level vis-a-vis the Iranians and at the local level vis-a-vis Lebanon. They were losing this thing. So when the ceasefire came about, They may not have been able to influence the Americans in terms of what to do with the Iranians, but they were trying to signal that they want to separate Iran from Lebanon, and Lebanon is theirs, and they want to be able to change the strategic balance in Lebanon before things could kind of calm down here. So I think that's their way. So it was definitely one of, if not, maybe not the only, but one of the most incredible days that I think anybody that was here would remember for a very long time.
There's a couple of things you said here that I want to unpack, but let's start about what Israel's actually doing right now. So most of the analysis, is, as you also have mentioned, is that Israel didn't like the ceasefire being announced by the U.S. and Iran. And these attacks were kind of an Israeli attempt to kind of torpedo the deal. Is that how you see it as well?
Oh, I think it's clear. I'm not sure there's much controversy or debate in this. I don't even think the Israelis are particularly denying this. I mean, it's very clear. They were not consulted with the American negotiators towards the end. They were not happy that the war in Iran, or at least that the Americans wanted to have some kind of ceasefire for whatever reason with Iran. It's clear that the Israeli objective differs from the American objective, and the Israeli objective in Iran is to fragment the place. It's not simply regime change or to stop nuclear enrichment or any of this kind of stuff. It's to ensure that Iran is not a feasible state, like a state that can act as a sovereign, proper state, and that can certainly project any kind of dominance in the region for years and years and years to come. So that's the fact that they were unable to achieve this is something that drives them to want to continue the war in Iran regionally. And once that's been put on a separate track by the United States, for now, they're in the meantime saying, okay, well, we want to be able to continue in Lebanon because we've not achieved our objectives in Lebanon. And so we will not accept this. And as I said, this attack on Wednesday in particular was a very clear, in a sense, I would say, defiance to Trump himself. And Trump, of course, very quickly, as we all saw, kind of, after saying first that Lebanon was included in the deal, immediately started, after a phone call with Netanyahu, changed his mind and said, no, Lebanon is not included in the ceasefire. So we see that Netanyahu has already gotten to the Americans and to Trump, and this is hanging in the balance now. There is, I think, and we can talk about it, but there is something in terms of what the Lebanese government is trying to negotiate, which is now a separate track, which we can get into if you want, but that's a separate issue. But to answer your question, yes, clearly this is a way for the Israelis to say, we don't accept the ceasefire, and we reserve the right to terrorize Beirut and Lebanon as much as we want, based on what happened after the 2024 war.
And you were saying earlier in our chat, you were saying that Israel was losing strategically in Iran. And so by that logic, does that ceasefire, the ceasefire between the U.S. and Iran, represent a weakened position for Israel? Because basically Netanyahu was betting on Trump to stay the course, let's say.
Absolutely. Not just stay the course. They are pushing America to invade, to get themselves increasingly involved in ground, in sending ground troops, getting mired into it, because that for them would lead to both, really the weakening of all the Gulf states, which is good for them, and as I said, the kind of weakening of Iran, not just the civilian infrastructure, its oil infrastructure, its removal of Iran as a strong state that is able to have some form of influence and to break Israeli hegemony across the region. So that's something that is a goal. And if that means, fighting to the last American military person, that's what they want to do. So anything short of that is something that doesn't achieve Israeli objectives. No ceasefire or truce that keeps the Iranian, not just the so-called Iranian regime, but sort of Iran intact as it is something that the Israelis will be satisfied with, let alone the Lebanon part of it.
Okay, well, let's actually talk about the Lebanese government and its role. Again, there was other pointers that say that this was a pressure campaign by Israel to force the Lebanese government to confront Hezbollah directly. Again, how do we understand that?
Well, I mean, that's a kind of a bizarre way to put it, because the Lebanese government. It's bizarre, yeah, because the Lebanese government, as the day that Hezbollah escalated after Khamenei was killed in Iran, and then Hezbollah escalated, didn't start the war, it escalated the Israelis. I mean, just to backtrack, there was a ceasefire agreement in the end of 2024 which lasted for 14 or 15 months until the American-Israeli attack on Iran and then the subsequent Hezbollah escalation here. So for those 14 or 15 months where there was a ceasefire deal, the UN recorded over 10,000 violations by the Israelis. From the Lebanese side, including Hezbollah, there were zero violations, no attacks that came from the Lebanese side towards the other. So the war had been ongoing, and the Israelis had killed several hundred people in Lebanon. If you live anywhere in Lebanon, in Beirut or otherwise, you will. I mean, even now, the drones are always above us. They're always, like last night, they were very loud. So there's always the drones. There's always somebody, something that's above us, making noise, hitting, surveilling. It's always, the presence is always there, and it was like that, even though that was against the terms of the ceasefire deal. So what happened in this last, when Hezbollah escalated in, I think the end of last month, what happened was that the Lebanese government met and immediately declared that the security and military side of Hezbollah was, at that point, to be considered unlawful in Lebanon. So they had taken steps. As far as the Lebanese government, which doesn't have a particular force, the army itself is not very strong. There's no real security forces, but it has this sense of being able to give or take legitimacy in that sense. And they actually passed a resolution removing legitimacy effectively from the military and security side of Hezbollah. So they were already working on that. The second thing they did was that they declared for the first time, so both the government and the president of the republic declared that they wanted immediately to enter into direct negotiations with Israel, which again, these two things were unprecedented. So the government and the president were signaling very clearly, very loudly, and very directly that they basically condemned what Hezbollah was doing. It condemned this kind of what they consider, in a sense, to be an Iranian initiative in Lebanon, and they signaled that they want to be on the side of, extricating Lebanon from all these wars, from coming up with some kind of direct negotiations under American auspices, and basically throwing themselves into the international community and saying, please tell the Israelis to stop attacking us. We had nothing to do with this Hezbollah attack. We are doing everything we can to delegitimize Hezbollah and to enter into negotiations with Israel. So please spare us all these Israeli attacks. So that's the way this is where they kind of play out. So to go back to what you were saying about the Israelis wanting to do this, yeah.
So then, following on that, what do you make of Netanyahu's recent statement where he said that there's no ceasefire in Lebanon, but at the same time that he said that he's ordered his cabinet to open kind of talks with the Lebanese government?
Yeah, I think that was a concession to some U.S. pressure. The U.S. is close to this government. Let's just say there are close ties between this government and the United States. And they are trying to pressure the Israelis to at least kind of go through the pretense of saying, okay, we accept. Because what happened, as I said, when the Lebanese government said, we want to have direct talks with the Israelis never responded. So instead, what the Israelis were doing was they stepped up their invasion of Lebanon, their attacks, their strikes across the country. A quarter of the country are now displaced, a huge part of South Lebanon displaced, the Dahi suburbs of Beirut all displaced. This was after the government said, we want to enter negotiations. And the Israelis, as I said, refused they didn't even respond to that. So now with what's going on regionally, they're responding, I think, to some American pressure to at least say, please respond to them. So this is what Netanyahu did, say, okay, yes, we'll enter it. But his condition for entering is we will continue to attack Lebanon and then we'll see how the talks go. And the talks are supposed to be held in Washington, D.C. But Netanyahu's position is, we'll talk, but meanwhile, we continue the war. What Hezbollah and what many others are saying in Lebanon, and even the government, I think, has kind of said, is to say, look, you need to have a ceasefire in Lebanon so that we can negotiate. I mean, the idea of going, if the Lebanese government ends up sending a negotiating team while the Israelis are still attacking Lebanon, this would be pretty humiliating. So I don't think that this Lebanese government can afford to do that.
And how do we understand the position of Hezbollah right now? I mean, is it trying to use the situation to shore up more support? And given how divided Lebanese society is at the moment because of this war?
Yeah, well, I think Hezbollah, first and foremost, is trying, is focused on fighting the Israelis. There is a resistance that's going on that is a very, very old resistance. There's been a very, very long history of Israeli occupations and attacks and just general uh, violence and creating massive instability across Lebanon, but especially obviously in southern Lebanon. And Hezbollah its open position is to say Israelis must remove itself from all the occupation points, must cease to be a threat to Lebanon, which is in a sense Lebanon's official position as well in that way. So Hezbollah is telling the Lebanese government, and remember Hezbollah is part of the Lebanese government. People
Sure.
forget that they have
People
ministers
do forget it.
represented.
Yes. Yeah.
They're represented in the government itself, but their position is basically, if before you go into any other steps, make sure, let's use what's going on. Let's use the fact that the Israelis have not been able to gain everything they wanted. The Israelis have wanted, they keep talking about creating a massive buffer zone across South Lebanon. They say they want to occupy it. They say they want to do X, Y, and Z, but they've not been able to do any of this. They have managed, as I said, to push the displaced. They've managed to do scorched earth policy, basically in the 1, 2, 3 kilometers in the borders, but they've not been able to take any of the major towns or areas in this basically fierce resistance going on. So Hezbollah is telling everybody in Lebanon, why should we accept Israeli terms when they are not winning? It's one thing if they're winning and you sort of have no choice, but in this case, they are clearly not winning. Massive destruction, yes. Massive violence, yes. But they're not winning strategically and they're not winning on the ground. Why would you want to give them something, even entering negotiations from a very weak point instead of from a stronger point? So that's Hezbollah's position. They are now very much at odds with the way in which this Lebanese government is going. And frankly, if it stays like this, a lot of people in Lebanon are worried that Israel's second objective, so my argument is the Israelis have been unable to achieve their strategic objective of occupying the south or creating a buffer zone or doing any of this kind of stuff. What they're trying now to do, which is also a very long-standing plan, which is to try to create conditions of civil war or civil strife or conflict or something, some kind of massive internal conflict, sectarian or otherwise conflict inside Lebanon. And that way, the Hezbollah kind of gets drawn into this kind of internal conflict. You end up, and in their best case scenario, in our worst case scenario, you end up having a Lebanese army confronting Hezbollah by force, and then that becomes a disaster across Lebanon and something that would lead really to the fracture, not just of the army, but to a very dangerous moment that I think most people in Lebanon want to try to avoid. So that's the Israeli strategy. If they can't achieve what they want militarily on the ground, they're going to try to do it through trying to push for civil war and civil strife inside Lebanon. And the Lebanese government is now in this delicate position where it needs to be able to avoid serving the Israeli interest, indirectly in that sense, and at the same time trying to claim its position that no, it's the only entity that officially is able to negotiate. Its position is, I don't want Iran to negotiate on my behalf. I don't want anyone to negotiate on my behalf. I'm a sovereign state. Only I get to negotiate. And I want to negotiate directly with the Israelis through the Americans. And that's the only way to achieve a proper ceasefire. And that's the only way to achieve Israelis withdrawal from South Lebanon. Hezbollah and many others look at that and say, that's kind of ridiculous. The Lebanese government has nothing to negotiate with, right? They've already delegitimized Hezbollah's military wing. They don't. The army itself really is not an army that's able to. It's legitimate, but it doesn't have any way to actually fight the Israelis. The army doesn't really have a way to confront Hezbollah militarily as well. So going to negotiate, what exactly do you have to negotiate? What are your cards? So these are kind of the internal debates that are taking place. There's a lot of posturing, but there's also a lot of fear, I think, inside Lebanon that this will lead to some kind of internal problems.
I'm gonna come back to that in a second because there's a couple things that we can unpack. But you mentioned the buffer zone, fears over the buffer zone, and one of the Israeli talking points that has been prevalent in the media the last while is that their goal is to eliminate Hezbollah. They want to eliminate and disarm Hezbollah in Lebanon. Now, there was a Israeli army official that was actually heavily quoted in Israeli media just the other day who said that, disarming Hezbollah is actually unrealistic, and the real plan is a buffer zone that
Yeah.
goes from the south up to the Litani River. Now, does that signal, does that mean that southern Lebanon becomes a zone of permanent war or permanent occupation in the near future?
It has been. I mean, I keep reminding people, and now more and more people are reminding people that the Israelis, from 1919, there are documents going back to the Zionist delegations that were trying to get the British to put the border of the Palestine-Lebanon border to the Litani River, because they knew, and we're talking 1919, before the State of Israel was created, knowing that they wanted at the time the water resources and the economic, the kind of the fertile agricultural lands, etc., of South Lebanon. Since then, every few decades, we go through the same thing. Ben Gurion talked about it. Others talked about it. In 1982, in 78, Israelis invaded South Lebanon. In 1982, there was a major invasion where they went all the way to Beirut. They besieged Beirut. I was there. I was a kid. And then they were forced to withdraw as the PLO left and the Palestinian kind of fighters left, and that was replaced by the Lebanese resistance, including what came to be Hezbollah, and you ended up with an occupation zone literally in South Lebanon, from the Litani River to the border of Palestine, for 18 years. They only left in the year 2000, still kept some parts that were considered to be Lebanese occupied lands, then invaded again in 2006. And then now 2023, 2024, and now again in 2020, whatever we are, 2026 now.
So can we see this, Professor, through the prism of Greater Israel, in the sense of Israel expanding its territory?
It's you can think about it as Greater Israel, ideologically, some. You can think about it as sort of the more hard-nosed security lens, whether it's the ideological part of it or not. People will dismiss it, say, oh, it's just a bunch of crazy people talking about Greater Israel. Yeah, some, and those kind of crazy settler types that are now running the government, yes. The security types for a very long time said, well, we need South Lebanon, just like we need the Golan, just like we need all of these other areas across the neighbors, eventually Sinai too in Egypt. I think that's going to come back, to say, look, we need this for our security. Others will say we need it for our resources, our water, our fertile, we need it to expand. We need to project our hegemony across the region. I mean, there are multiple ways over the past century that the Zionists and the Israelis have been explaining why they want to expand into these areas, including South Lebanon, but they're consistent. The consistency is they want to have control. Call it occupation, call it a buffer zone, call it whatever you want. The idea is that for them, South Lebanon should be part of their sphere of influence, whether de facto or de jure. And that's been clear, and it's been demonstrated over decades and decades and decades. And let me be clear, as far as I'm concerned, as far as many people are concerned, if there was no resistance in Lebanon, South Lebanon would have been lost a long time ago. So that needs to be very clear.
Okay, now let me get your position and thoughts on the U.S.-Iran ceasefire. I mean, there was a lot of chaotic messaging coming out of what's been agreed upon. I mean, the U.S. said that the 10 points that they agreed to weren't the 10 points that Iran shared publicly, and again, Iran saying it's kind of the same thing, but towards the U.S., and then the mediator saying, Pakistan saying that Lebanon was included in the agreement, Israel saying Lebanon was not, and so what is your thoughts on all of this?
Vis-a-vis Lebanon, I would say, I mean, in general, I think the agreement, yeah, of course, there's a lack of clarity, because that's how these things are done, especially when they're very last minute, and it's designed to stop a massive American attack. God knows what they were planning to do. It was clear that there was something that nobody wanted, so this was an intervention. So there's never going to be real clarity in the way these things are arranged. But what does seem fairly clear on the Lebanon front was that Lebanon was included. Now, whether the Americans, I mean, from what we understand, the Americans weren't consulting the Israelis at that stage, and they went along with the idea that Lebanon should be included because it was for the whole region. So the Iranians were saying, okay, we're including America's Gulf allies, so why not include our allies, meaning Hezbollah and in Lebanon in this case, and Iraq. And so the idea was that there would be a total ceasefire across the region. It also seems clear that as soon as that happened, Netanyahu picked up the phone, called Trump, and told him, "No, I don't want this to happen, and you have to retract that." And as usual, and there's a long history, and we know this. Netanyahu has his way with Trump, and then Trump immediately starts to backtrack and say, "Oh well, no, Lebanon is not really included. And then the Americans, one after the other, start parroting this idea that Lebanon is not included. And this is dangerous, of course, because as I said from in the beginning, when we first started this chat, the Israeli idea is twofold. First, they want to ensure that the Americans remain fighting in Iran. And one way to do this is to create tension within this regional ceasefire agreement, to get the Iranians to be in a position where they have to say, okay, you're either defending Lebanon and Hezbollah, or you're betraying them. And if you want to defend them and not comply, then you will be blamed for the kind of the breakdown of the ceasefire. And if you keep with the ceasefire with the Americans, then hey, you're betraying your allies and you're betraying Lebanon, and this is going to be played as a very big problem inside Lebanon, and they'll play this out. So they want to put Iran in a very, very difficult position and shift the blame to them. The Iranians now are saying, no, we're not going to negotiate until all of this, until you agree that Lebanon is part of the ceasefire. And that this is where we are today. That's why I was saying, the kind of the interesting track that comes out now is this what you mentioned, that Netanyahu now comes out and says finally, yes, okay, we accept that we will have an agreement, or we'll start negotiating with the Lebanese government. And maybe that's the way where the Americans and the Israelis can say, okay, we're going to have like a lull or some kind of cessation of hostility as a way to reward the Lebanese government, and not because it's part of the Iran regional deal, but somehow to reward the Lebanese government because they want to keep this wedge between the Lebanese government and Hezbollah. And for the Israelis, it's very, very important to keep a wedge between Iran and in the kind of larger regional picture, and Lebanon, which they want it to be a separate file. They do not want Iran to be negotiating on behalf of Lebanon. So these are the kind of two interesting issues that I think we need to kind of keep track.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about the significance of Israel
Yeah.
trying to disconnect Lebanon, the Lebanese front from
Yeah,
Iran.
hugely
I think
important.
You just answered it.
Yeah.
I think my last question before I let you go, Professor, is the biggest takeaways. One or two points that you think people should be looking at right now in the sense of Israel bombing Lebanon.
I think the first is the most obvious one, which is looking at the history of 100 years, which is that the Israelis will not stop. The Israelis do not respect treaties. They do not respect ceasefires. They have their ambitions. It's long stated, as we mentioned, and people can couch it and say, "Well, no, it's not." There's conflict between the army and between the politicians and between the right wing, and it all comes to the same, as far as people in Lebanon are concerned, which is they want to exert control in Lebanon. So this war will not stop in that sense. What they're going to try to do simply, and this same thing happened in the 2006 war when the Israelis had to eventually stop the war and withdraw, and that is they try to throw the problem onto the Lebanese government, onto the Lebanese state, and onto the Lebanese army. And they'll say, hey, you, the army, you, the government, you want to deal with us? You want to have something? Okay, you go disarm Hezbollah. You go disarm the resistance. You declare the resistance illegitimate. You go ahead and do that. We're going to be sitting here with our drones, with our surveillance, and ready to go. And if you can't do it, well, we're going to intervene again. So that's the best case scenario. And what does that do? That sets up the conditions of a civil war. Because obviously, if the Israelis, after all this time, have been unable to disarm Hezbollah and defeat Hezbollah, how is the Lebanese government with an army which, by the way, is very popular across Lebanon, but is funded effectively, organized and funded by the United States? How is it possible that it's going to be able to do this job? The army cooperates with Hezbollah. There was, based on the 2024 ceasefire deal, it is true that the army was cooperating with Hezbollah to remove, per the agreement, a lot of Hezbollah's weapons that was south of the Litani River. They did it, not all, but they did do a chunk of it, and they were working with them effectively in that sense. The issue was then going to be north of the Litani River, and there that was going to be for sort of, an internal Lebanese agreement that had to take place in order that takes in several other issues, such as if you disarm Hezbollah completely, well, guys, who's going to protect Lebanon? You're just going to allow the Israelis to come in at any other point. So you want to remove the only force that has some kind of capability to defend against the Israelis when you have no actual defense plan, and you have clear clear enemies that do not respect agreements. We've seen it. So the takeaway is the Israelis will continue to escalate. The Israelis will never let this go. And the Israelis will continue to push for, if not military wars, civil wars inside Lebanon, as they will in Syria, as they will across the region. And so there needs to be some other way to deal with it as we move forward.
And on that note, we're going to leave it here. Professor Karim Makdisi, thank you so much for coming on MEE Live. I want to thank you for your time, and I want to thank our viewers as well. Thanks for tuning in, and see you next time.